Most people think weakness begins when life becomes too hard. It usually begins much earlier than that. It begins when comfort becomes the quiet ruler of your decisions. When ease starts deciding when you begin. When mood starts deciding how much you endure. When resistance starts deciding what gets delayed, softened, or abandoned. And because none of this looks dramatic at first, most people never notice the real damage while it is happening. They just notice the result. A weaker mind. A softer will. A shorter attention span for difficulty. A lower tolerance for boredom, pressure, inconvenience, or emotional friction. A life that keeps drifting toward what feels good now, while quietly losing the strength it will need later. That is the danger of comfort. Not that it feels pleasant. Not that rest exists. Not that relief has value. The danger is that if comfort keeps getting the final say, it does not merely soothe you. It trains you. It trains you to delay. It trains you to retreat. It trains you to negotiate with every hard thing. It trains your mind to expect ease where life will require steadiness. And over time, the problem is no longer that difficult things exist. The problem is that you have become easier to overrule by them. That is how people slowly lose power without ever collapsing. They do not fall apart all at once. They just become less willing to stay with effort. Less willing to move before they feel ready. Less able to hold a standard when comfort offers a softer option. Less trustworthy to themselves in the moments that matter. And that is a painful thing to feel. To know you are capable of more discipline than you keep living. To know your mind could be stronger than it has become. To know that some part of your suffering does not come from life alone, but from how often you have let ease shape your character in your place. So this audiobook is not about glorifying pain. It is not about becoming harsh, joyless, or emotionally dry. It is about something more important than that. It is about understanding why comfort weakens the mind and why self-control makes it stronger. Because self-control is not punishment. It is training. It is the decision to stop letting relief make every decision for you. It is the willingness to choose what strengthens over what merely soothes. It is the quiet construction of a mind that can stay, begin, return, endure, and hold its shape when life stops being easy. And that kind of strength does not arrive by accident. It is built every time you do not kneel to the easier option. Every time you refuse to let softness become your standard. Every time you choose the harder good over the immediate comfort that would have made you smaller. So if you have felt yourself becoming softer than you want to be, if you are tired of negotiating with resistance, if you know what it means to keep choosing ease and quietly losing respect for yourself because of it, then this is where the real work begins. Because the mind does not become strong by being protected from every difficulty. It becomes strong when it learns how to stop serving comfort as if comfort were a master. Weakness rarely begins with collapse. More often, it begins with preference. A small desire to make things easier. A small decision to wait. A small refusal to sit with discomfort. A small habit of choosing what soothes instead of what strengthens. And because each individual choice looks harmless, the deeper pattern stays hidden for a long time. That is how ease starts deciding who you become. Not through one obvious failure, but through repeated moments in which comfort is quietly allowed to lead. You do not notice it at first. You just start negotiating more with effort. You start postponing what feels heavy. You start bending your standards around your mood, your energy, your convenience. And little by little, the mind begins adapting to a softer law. If this feels uncomfortable, delay it. If it feels demanding, avoid it. If relief is available, take it. That law changes a person. Because small preferences do not stay small. They become habits. Habits become expectations. and expectations begin shaping identity. What started as "I just need a break" slowly becomes "I struggle to stay with hard things." What started as "I'll do it later" slowly becomes "I'm not as disciplined as I should be." What started as a few soft choices becomes a private disappointment you can feel but do not always know how to name. That disappointment matters because many people are not suffering from obvious failure. They are suffering from the quiet recognition that they are becoming easier to overrule. Resistance speaks and they listen too quickly. Discomfort appears and they retreat too early. Effort is required and some part of them immediately starts searching for an exit. They still want strength. They still admire discipline. They still believe in the person they could be. But in practice, ease keeps winning too many ordinary moments. This is not because comfort is evil. Comfort has a place, rest has a place, relief has a place. The problem begins when ease stops being something you use wisely and starts becoming something that trains you. Because whatever repeatedly decides your behavior eventually helps decide your character. If comfort keeps getting the final say, then the mind adapts to that arrangement. It becomes less willing to endure, less willing to wait, less willing to do what is necessary when necessity does not feel pleasant. That is how the weakening happens. Quietly, reasonably, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the issue is not that life has become harder. The issue is that you have become softer in the places where strength was supposed to grow. And once a person sees that clearly, they are finally looking at the real problem. Not comfort itself, but the slow surrender that begins when ease keeps being allowed to decide who they are. And the damage almost never looks dramatic in the beginning. That is what makes it so easy to excuse. A person chooses rest when effort would have strengthened them. They postpone the difficult conversation because emotional ease feels wiser. They delay the task, soften the standard, lower the demand, and tell themselves it is only temporary. But repeated comfort has a direction. It does not only protect you from discomfort in the moment, it teaches you what kind of person to become in the long run. And when relief keeps outranking effort, something quiet begins to weaken. Consistency weakens first, then resilience, then follow-through, then self-respect. Not because a person suddenly becomes incapable, but because their mind is being trained to expect an easier path than real life is willing to give. That is why weakness is often so hard to detect early. It does not always feel like failure. Sometimes it feels like permission, like flexibility, like being gentle with yourself, like taking the easier route just this once. But over time, just this once becomes a pattern, and patterns build a life. A person begins fewer hard things, endures less, recovers more slowly from resistance, finds ordinary, demands heavier than they used to feel. What once required discipline now feels unreasonable. What once felt possible now feels draining before it even begins. This is the quiet damage of always choosing what feels good. You do not only lose output, you lose stamina. You do not only lose time, you lose seriousness. You do not only delay action, you weaken the part of yourself that was supposed to become stronger through action. And eventually, the consequences stop being private. Comfort-trained weakness shows up in work because focus collapses too quickly when effort stops feeling pleasant. It shows up in habits because structure keeps bending around mood. It shows up in relationships because emotional discomfort becomes harder to tolerate, so patience thins and avoidance grows. It shows up in self-trust because every time you watch yourself choose immediate relief over what you know would strengthen you, some part of you begins to doubt your own solidity. That is the deepest loss. Not productivity, not image, self-respect. Because self-respect depends partly on knowing that when something important becomes difficult, you do not instantly become negotiable. And if comfort keeps winning, that confidence starts fading. You begin to feel more breakable than you want to be, more dependent on the right mood, the right energy, the right emotional climate. This is why comfort-led living becomes dangerous. Not because pleasure is wrong, not because ease is always weakness, but because immediate relief, when chosen too often, quietly trades away the very strength that would have made life more bearable in the first place. This is where many people become resistant. The moment they hear the phrase self-control, something in them tightens. They picture punishment. They picture cold discipline, rigid self-denial, harsh routines, joyless restraint, a life built on force. They imagine becoming someone severe with themselves, someone emotionally dry, someone who wins through pressure but loses softness, humanity, and peace. But that is not real self-control. That is fear, misunderstanding discipline. Real self-control is not cruelty, it is training. Training asks a different question, not how do I punish myself for being weak, but how do I strengthen the part of me that keeps giving comfort too much authority, not how do I become harder, but how do I become steadier, not how do I stop needing ease, but how do I stop letting ease decide what I do, what I avoid, and who I become. That distinction changes everything. Because punishment is driven by disgust, training is driven by purpose. Punishment says, you are failing so you deserve pressure. Training says, you are capable of more so you need practice. Punishment creates shame around effort. Training creates structure around growth. And if a person confuses the two, they will either fear discipline or use it badly. They will reject self-control because it sounds inhuman, or they will embrace it in a way that damages them. Both paths miss the point. Self-control, at its best, is an act of intelligent care. It is the decision to stop feeding the patterns that make you weaker. It is the willingness to do what strengthens you even when comfort offers an easier alternative. It is choosing not to obey every mood, every resistance, every excuse, every soft negotiation that asks for relief at the expense of growth. That is not self-hatred. That is self-respect in motion. A person who trains does not expect every day to feel easy. They understand that boredom, friction, reluctance, and effort are part of development. They do not read discomfort as proof that something is wrong. They read it more wisely. Sometimes discomfort is simply the feeling of becoming less governable by weakness. That is why self-control deserves respect. Not because it makes life smaller, but because it makes the self stronger. Not because it removes feeling, but because it prevents feeling from becoming the ruler. Not because it is hard for the sake of hardness, but because it teaches the mind how to stay faithful to what matters when ease is trying to take over. So the goal here is not to become punishing. It is to become trained. To become someone who can meet comfort without kneeling to it. Someone who can feel resistance without obeying it. Someone who can build a life around what strengthens, rather than around whatever happens to feel easiest today. That is the real dignity of self-control. Not hardness, but preparation. Not self-attack, but inner strengthening. Not cruelty, but the disciplined construction of a stronger mind. One of the main reasons comfort has so much power over people is not that comfort is always stronger than principle. It is that comfort is often faster. It speaks before discipline fully gathers, before long-term thinking returns, before standards remember themselves, before the stronger part of you has fully taken its seat. And because it speaks in the language of relief, it can sound wise almost instantly. You feel resistance, and comfort says, not now. You feel tired, and comfort says, tomorrow will be better. You feel discomfort, and comfort says, step back, soften, wait, reduce the demand. That speed matters more than most people realize. Because in many ordinary moments, the battle is decided before it even feels like a battle. The easier option arrives first, offers emotional relief, and wraps itself in reason. By the time strength begins to speak, the mind has often already started leaning toward surrender. A task has already been delayed. A standard has already been softened. A difficult but necessary action has already been quietly edited into something easier, smaller, or later. That is why so many people look back on weak decisions with confusion. They ask themselves, why did I give in so quickly? Why did I choose the easier thing again when I know exactly where that path leads? And the answer is often less dramatic than they imagine. It was not always a deeply chosen betrayal of character. Very often, it was rapid surrender. Relief arrived first, and nothing stronger arrived in time. This is important because it changes the emotional meaning of weakness. Many people shame themselves as if every weak moment were some final statement about who they are, but often the mechanism is simpler. Comfort moved fast. Strength moved slowly. The easier option felt emotionally reasonable before the stronger option had fully formed. That does not remove responsibility, but it makes the struggle easier to understand. And what becomes understandable becomes more workable. You can see this everywhere once you notice it. A hard conversation needs to happen, but comfort quickly suggests waiting for a better emotional window. A demanding task is sitting in front of you, but comfort offers a softer sequence. Check something first, rest first, think about it longer, begin later. A difficult return is needed after drift, but comfort says the day is already compromised, so real effort can begin tomorrow. In each case, the easier option does not present itself as weakness. It presents itself as relief. And that is the problem. Because immediate relief has an emotional advantage. It asks less right now. It lowers tension right now. It removes friction right now. Strength, by contrast, often asks you to stay, to begin, to continue, to tolerate the discomfort that comfort is trying to help you escape, which means strength often sounds quieter in the first few seconds, even when it is the wiser voice. So many weak decisions are not deeply chosen. They are quickly surrendered to. And once you understand that, you stop asking only, "Why am I so weak?" You begin asking a better question. What keeps getting access to my behavior before my deeper standards do? Because if comfort speaks first, then self-control must learn how to answer sooner. That is how comfort wins in a moment. But moments are not the deepest danger. The deeper danger is what repeated moments become. Because the mind is not weakened only by one soft decision, one delayed task, one avoided discomfort, or one lowered standard. It is weakened when those choices are repeated often enough that they stop feeling like choices at all. What begins as preference slowly becomes pattern. What becomes pattern starts becoming expectation, and expectation eventually begins shaping character. This is how repetition turns preference into character. A person avoids one difficult task because resistance feels unusually strong. Then they avoid another, then another. Over time, avoidance is no longer experienced as an occasional response. It becomes routine. The mind begins expecting escape. Effort starts feeling optional. Friction starts feeling unfair. And what once required a conscious decision to step back now happens almost automatically. The same is true in smaller forms. You delay once because you do not feel ready. You soften a standard once because the day feels heavy. You choose the easier version once because it seems harmless. But repetition teaches the mind quickly. It learns what it can ask for. It learns which forms of discomfort you are willing to leave. It learns how little resistance is needed to make you reconsider what you already know should be done. And once it learns that, comfort stops appearing as one voice among many. It starts sounding like necessity. That is when weakness becomes structural. Resistance becomes more persuasive, not because it has become wiser, but because it has been obeyed so often that it now carries familiarity. Ease becomes more expected, not because life truly demands it, but because the mind has adapted to receiving it. Self-control begins to feel unnatural, not because it is wrong, but because what is untrained will always feel less familiar than what has been repeatedly indulged. This is why people often misread their own condition. They say, "I'm just not disciplined. I'm just not built for pressure. I've always struggled with consistency." But many of these statements are not descriptions of fixed identity. They are descriptions of repeated conditioning. They are what happens when enough small permissions have been granted that surrender now feels personal rather than patterned. That distinction matters, because when conditioning starts feeling like personality, people stop challenging what still needs to be challenged. They protect it, excuse it, build around it. What could still be retrained begins getting treated like essence. And that is how a temporary weakness becomes a stable self-concept. Think of how this happens in real life. Someone repeatedly chooses relief over effort, and eventually effort starts feeling emotionally hostile. Someone repeatedly waits for the right mood to begin, and eventually beginning without the right mood feels unnatural. Someone repeatedly escapes discomfort at the earliest sign, and eventually even ordinary friction feels heavier than it really is. This is not fate. It is repetition doing its work. That is the sober truth. Every repeated surrender to comfort is building something. It is teaching the mind what to expect, what to avoid, what to negotiate, and how easily standards can be bent. Over time, that teaching becomes character-like, not because it is permanent, but because it has been practiced enough to feel natural. And that is why repetition matters so much. Because if repeated comfort can weaken you, repeated self-control can strengthen you. Both become structure. Both become expectation. Both eventually feel more natural. The question is not whether you are training your mind. The question is what you are training it to become. One of the reasons comfort is so hard to challenge is that it rarely speaks in an obviously weak voice. It does not usually say, "Become smaller." It does not usually say, "Avoid what would strengthen you." It does not usually say, "Trade your future stability for present relief." It sounds much wiser than that. It sounds like discernment, like self-care, like timing, like emotional honesty, like a reasonable adjustment to how hard things feel right now. That is why comfort is persuasive. It does not only offer ease, it offers explanation. It gives the mind a story that makes surrender feel intelligent. You are not avoiding the task, you are waiting for better clarity. You are not stepping back from growth, you are honoring your emotional state. You are not softening the standard, you are being humane with yourself. And because these explanations contain just enough truth, they become difficult to question. This is what makes comfort dangerous. It often borrows the language of wisdom without carrying the discipline of wisdom. Real self-care exists. Discernment exists. Timing matters. Rest matters. Kindness toward yourself matters. But comfort is skilled at imitating all of them. That is where many people get confused. They assume that because an inner voice sounds gentle, it must be wise. Because it sounds compassionate, it must be protective. Because it offers relief, it must be helping. But what feels kind in the moment is not always kind across time. Sometimes the voice that protects you from present discomfort is also the voice that quietly keeps you weak. Think about how this works in daily life. A person says, "I need to listen to myself today," but what that really means is, "I do not want to face the friction this would require." Someone says, "I'm just not in the right headspace," when the deeper reality is that they have made emotional readiness a requirement for action. Someone says, "I deserve a break," but the break is not interrupting healthy effort. It is interrupting the exact kind of pressure that would have strengthened discipline. Notice the pattern. Comfort takes a real human need and extends it beyond its proper place. Rest becomes retreat. Compassion becomes permission. Sensitivity becomes excuse. Discernment becomes delay. That is why comfort always sounds so reasonable. It does not need to lie completely. It only needs to distort enough truth to gain authority. It takes something valid and turns it into a shield against effort, endurance, or correction. This is why you must learn to separate comfort logic from actual wisdom. Comfort logic asks, what would feel better right now? Actual wisdom asks, what will make me stronger and truer over time? Comfort logic asks, how can I reduce this discomfort? Actual wisdom asks, is this discomfort harmful or is it training? Comfort logic focuses on immediate emotional relief. Actual wisdom includes long-term consequence, character, and direction. That distinction changes the whole inner conversation. Because once you understand how comfort disguises itself, you become less likely to kneel to every soft argument your mind produces. You begin asking better questions. Is this truly care, or is it avoidance in a gentler voice? Is this wise adjustment, or am I quietly lowering my standard? Is this rest that restores strength, or relief that replaces it? These questions do not make you harsh. They make you honest. And honesty matters here, because comfort can carry real signals without deserving final authority. Sometimes you do need rest. Sometimes you do need restraint. Sometimes you do need to step back. But if comfort is always allowed to interpret those needs for you, it will keep rewriting necessity in the image of ease. That is the deeper lesson. Not every thought that sounds soft is kind, and not every choice that feels good is wise. Sometimes the voice that sounds most understanding in the moment is the very voice quietly training you to remain weak. For many people, weakness does not begin when life becomes hard. It begins when discomfort starts being treated like danger. The moment effort feels heavy, they pull back. The moment boredom appears, they look for escape. The moment resistance shows up, they assume something is wrong. And because that response becomes automatic, the mind slowly learns a damaging lesson. If friction is present, retreat. That lesson weakens everything. Because real life is full of friction. Not only pain, but ordinary friction. The kind that appears when you begin before you feel ready. When you stay with a task after the interesting part has faded. When you face uncertainty without immediate reassurance. When you continue through emotional flatness instead of waiting for inspiration to return. None of this is unusual. None of this is evidence that you are on the wrong path. Very often, it is simply the texture of growth. That is the reframe that changes a person. Discomfort is not always danger. Effort is not injury. Boredom is not a sign to quit. Resistance is not proof that today is not the day. Uncertainty is not always a warning. Delay in reward is not failure. Many of these experiences are not emergencies at all. They are training conditions. This matters because the mind becomes stronger the moment it stops misreading every form of friction as a reason to withdraw. If you keep treating discomfort like a problem to solve immediately, then comfort will keep becoming your default answer. But if you begin relating to friction more honestly, something shifts. You become less alarmed by effort, less negotiable in the presence of resistance, less likely to mistake a difficult moment for a wrong one. Think of how often people leave growth too early because they misinterpret the feeling that comes with it. They start something meaningful, then hit boredom and assume the energy is gone. They take a step toward discipline, then feel resistance, and assume they are not built for consistency. They enter a hard stretch, feel uncertain, and immediately begin searching for a softer route. What they are escaping is often not real danger. It is the ordinary discomfort of becoming less comfort-dependent. That is why the first strength is not intensity. It is not force. It is not aggression. It is not becoming emotionally hard. The first strength is staying. Staying long enough to discover that friction does not always deserve obedience. Staying long enough to let discomfort exist without instantly reorganizing your choices around it. Staying long enough to see that the mind can survive more effort, more boredom, more uncertainty, more ordinary pressure than comfort has trained it to believe. This is the beginning of real change. Not when life becomes easy, not when motivation becomes reliable, but when you stop treating every unpleasant sensation as a command to retreat. Because once discomfort is no longer confused with danger, the whole inner conversation changes. You are no longer always asking, "How do I get out of this feeling?" You begin asking a stronger question. Is this harming me, or is this shaping me? And very often, that answer is where strength begins. At this point, many people feel a kind of relief. They can see the pattern now. They understand that comfort weakens them. They can recognize the voice of avoidance more quickly. They know when resistance is speaking, when softness is disguising itself as wisdom, when ease is trying to bend the standard. That awareness matters. It is better to see the trap than to keep falling into it blindly. But this is also where many people stop too early. Because knowing what weakens you is not the same as refusing it. A person can understand their comfort patterns with great accuracy and still obey them every day. They can say, "I know I'm procrastinating because I want relief," and still delay. They can say, "I know this is just resistance," and still back away. They can describe their softness beautifully, explain their tendencies intelligently, even predict their own excuses in advance, and still hand the moment over to the same familiar pattern. That is one of the most common illusions in self-development, mistaking recognition for change. But recognition by itself changes very little. The mind does not become stronger just because you have become more observant. Comfort does not lose authority simply because you named its strategy correctly. Avoidance does not stop being persuasive because you understand its psychology. Awareness is valuable because it makes strength possible. But awareness is not strength. It is only the place where strength can begin. Something more is required. Refusal. That word matters because strength is not built by understanding comfort. It is built by declining to kneel to it. It is built in the moment when the easier option presents itself with a reasonable voice, and something in you answers no. Not because you hate yourself, not because you are trying to be harsh, but because you have decided that what weakens you will not keep receiving automatic permission. This is where standards enter. Without standards, awareness often stays passive. You notice what is happening, but nothing stronger takes the lead. You understand your weakness, but still let it decide. You become a thoughtful witness to your own surrender. And over time, that can create a polished kind of helplessness. Self-aware, articulate, emotionally intelligent, and still easily governed by what feels easiest. That is not maturity. Maturity begins when awareness joins hands with decision. When I know what this is becomes, and I will not obey it. When I can see the pattern becomes, and I have standards for how I respond. When I understand why I do this, becomes, and understanding will no longer be my substitute for refusal. That is the shift from reflection to command. Because character does not change when weakness becomes visible. Character changes when weakness stops being indulged. It changes when recognition is followed by direction, when insight is followed by behavior, when the mind is no longer allowed to treat self-knowledge as if it were already self-mastery. So the real question is not only, do I see what weakens me? The deeper question is, what do I do when I see it? That is where strength begins to separate itself from theory, not in the clarity of the diagnosis, but in the dignity of the refusal. So what does a strengthening mind actually look like? Not in slogans, not in dramatic speeches, not in the fantasy version where discipline feels electrifying and every hard thing is met with heroic intensity. What does it really feel like when the mind is becoming stronger? It feels quieter than most people expect. Because real strength is rarely loud. It does not usually arrive as aggression, visible hardness, or constant motivation. More often, It looks like a person who has stopped collapsing in the presence of ordinary friction, a person who can stay with what is necessary a little longer, a person who does not treat discomfort like a verdict, a person who no longer needs every hard thing to feel emotionally right before doing it. That is the quiet posture of a strengthening mind. Not dramatic toughness, steady willingness. Willingness to begin before the mood improves. Willingness to continue after the novelty fades. Willingness to return after drift without turning the drift into identity. Willingness to hold the line when comfort offers a softer version of the day. This posture matters because many people misunderstand strength. They imagine it as force. They imagine a powerful mind as one that dominates itself through pressure, overpowers every weakness instantly, and moves through life with relentless intensity. But intensity is unstable. It burns bright and often disappears. A strengthening mind is built on something more durable than intensity. It is built on steadiness. Steadiness is less exciting but far more trustworthy. It does not need to feel inspired to remain aligned. It does not need emotional momentum to keep a commitment alive. It does not become dramatic when things are hard. It simply keeps choosing what matters, even when the feeling of the moment is not especially cooperative. That is why self-control is best understood as a seat of command. A quiet inner place from which you decide that discomfort will not automatically change your direction. A place from which you can notice resistance without kneeling to it. A place from which you can say, "This is difficult, but difficulty does not get to decide for me." In ordinary life, this often looks almost unimpressive. It looks like beginning the task without ceremony. It looks like staying in the conversation without running from tension. It looks like returning to the routine after a lapse instead of waiting for a perfect restart. It looks like not making a small mood into a major permission slip. It looks like meeting boredom, effort, uncertainty, and resistance without turning them into reasons to retreat. That is how the mind actually gets stronger. Not through theatrical moments of self-conquest, but through repeated acts of staying, choosing, and returning. Through small dignified refusals to let ease become the ruler, through ordinary proof that pressure, reluctance, and friction do not automatically have the authority they once had. This is important because it makes strength more attainable. You do not need to become a different species of person. You do not need to become emotionally hard. You do not need to wait until you feel unusually powerful. You need a stronger posture, a way of standing inside effort that does not immediately bargain with comfort, a way of meeting resistance that does not instantly surrender, a way of relating to hard things that is serious, calm, and repeatable. That is the posture you are building. Not the posture of force, but of command. Not the posture of intensity, but of continuity. Not the posture of someone who never feels weakness, but of someone who no longer lets weakness make every decision. And once that posture begins to form, something changes quietly but profoundly. The mind becomes less fragile in the places where it once broke quickly. What used to feel like too much starts feeling survivable. What used to trigger retreat starts meeting steadiness instead. And from there, self-control stops feeling like a performance. It starts feeling like strength. If self-control is ever going to become real, it has to become real in time. Not afterward, when the easier choice has already been made. Not later, when the task has already been delayed, the standard has already been softened, or the day has already been handed over to resistance. It has to become real in the moment, when comfort first begins to speak. That is why the pause matters. The pause is the first act of self-control. It is the first visible sign that you are no longer willing to let ease, impulse, or resistance move directly into behavior without passing through something stronger. It is not complicated. It is not dramatic. but it is one of the most important skills a person can build, because many weak decisions survive only by happening too quickly to be challenged. That is worth understanding clearly. A great number of soft choices are not made after deep reflection. They are made through speed. Discomfort appears and the mind immediately looks for relief. Effort feels heavy and the body starts leaning away before principle has even spoken. Resistance enters and within seconds you are negotiating with the task, editing the standard, promising yourself you will return later. The movement is so fast that it feels natural, but natural is not the same as wise. This is where the pause changes everything. It interrupts the path between preference and action. It does not erase discomfort. It does not instantly make the harder choice easy, but it stops comfort from becoming decision without inspection. And that alone is powerful because in many moments weakness does not win because it is right. It wins because nothing interrupted it soon enough. Think of a familiar example. You are about to begin something necessary. Almost immediately, a softer impulse appears. Check something first, start later. Wait until your mind feels clearer. The untrained version of you moves with that first suggestion, but the pause breaks the sequence. You feel the pull and instead of obeying it, you stop. Briefly, deliberately. That stop creates room. Room to notice what is happening. Room to separate discomfort from instruction. Room to remember that the first preference is not always the best one. Room for strength to arrive before surrender becomes action. And that is why the pause is not weakness. It is not hesitation in the timid sense. It is not uncertainty. It is not passivity. It is intelligent interruption. It is the moment inner command re-enters the room. Without the pause, comfort feels like instinct. With the pause, comfort becomes visible, and once it becomes visible, it can be questioned. You can ask, what am I actually about to obey here? Is this real wisdom, real limitation, real need? Or is this simply the wish to avoid friction for a few more minutes? That question only becomes possible if there is space first. This is how strength starts becoming behavioral rather than philosophical. Not through extreme effort, but through interruption. Not by crushing every desire for ease, but by refusing to let every desire for ease make the decision. The pause is where self-control first takes form, because until the moment is interrupted, comfort is still leading. And once a person learns to pause well, something subtle but powerful begins to change. They are no longer trapped inside every first preference their mind produces. They begin reclaiming the small but decisive space where character is built, the space between what feels easiest and what deserves to be chosen. Once you learn to pause, the next task is to become more precise about what is actually speaking inside you. Because comfort rarely announces itself honestly. It does not usually say, I want to make you weaker. It does not usually say, I am asking you to trade strength for relief. It does not usually say, if you obey me often enough, I will slowly lower the quality of your character. It speaks in softer language than that. Later. Not now. You deserve a break. Tomorrow will be better. This is enough. You have already done a lot. You do not need to push today. There is no point forcing it in this state. That is the comfort voice. And one of the main reasons it has so much power is that most people do not identify it clearly enough. They hear the suggestion, feel the relief it offers, and treat it as thought rather than influence. But the moment you begin naming the comfort voice for what it is, something important changes. Its disguise weakens. It may still sound persuasive, but it stops sounding neutral. That is why naming matters. To name the comfort voice is not to become hostile toward yourself. It is to become honest about the psychological trade being offered. Because every comfort-based suggestion contains a bargain, whether or not it says so directly. It offers short-term relief in exchange for something quieter and more valuable. Continuity, seriousness, self-respect, momentum, endurance, identity. The relief is immediate. The cost is delayed, and that delay is what makes the voice so dangerous. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. You are about to start something difficult and the voice says, "Later." What sounds like timing is often just resistance asking for more room. You are in the middle of effort and the voice says, "This is enough." What sounds like balance is often just discomfort trying to stop the strengthening process early. You slip once and the voice says, "Start again tomorrow." What sounds like order is often just drift trying to turn one lapse into a pattern. This is the hidden trade beneath comfort. A few minutes of ease purchased with a weaker habit. A little emotional softness purchased with less self-trust. A little delay purchased with more reluctance next time. A little permission purchased with lower standards tomorrow. That is why the comfort voice must be exposed. Not because every desire for ease is wrong. Not because rest is fake. Not because gentleness has no place. But because if you cannot tell the difference between wise recovery and comfort seeking, then comfort will keep borrowing the language of wisdom and quietly shaping your life from behind the scenes. This is where self-control becomes a skill of perception. You begin listening differently to your own mind. You stop hearing every soft thought as truth. You start asking sharper questions. Is this real restoration, or am I simply trying to avoid friction? Is this enough, or do I just want discomfort to end? Is tomorrow truly wiser, or is that only today's resistance trying to survive? Those questions matter because they restore leverage. Once the comfort voice is named clearly, it no longer gets to operate with the same invisibility. You can hear the offer and also hear the cost. You can feel the relief it promises and also see what that relief is asking you to surrender in return. And that is often the moment a person becomes harder to deceive. Not harder in a cold sense. Harder to manipulate from within. Because now they understand that comfort is not only a feeling, it is often a negotiation. And once the negotiation is visible, the mind can no longer pretend that every soft option is harmless. It has to face the deeper question beneath every invitation to ease. What is this choice giving me now, and what is it quietly taking from me later? This is the point where self-control stops being an insight and becomes a structure. You can pause. You can hear the comfort voice. You can even recognize the trade it is offering. But if nothing steadier takes over after that, comfort can still win. You can see the pattern and still surrender to it. You can understand exactly what is happening and still let preference decide the day. That is why self-control becomes real only when standards begin leading where comfort wants to pull back. Standards are the inner rules that keep your life from being reorganized by ease. They answer the question that comfort keeps asking in different forms. When effort feels inconvenient, when resistance grows loud, when irritation makes softness seem reasonable, when drift asks for another day, what does final say? If the answer is still, whatever feels easiest right now, then comfort is still governing your character, no matter how much self-awareness you have built. This matters because comfort is too unstable to lead a strong life well. It changes with mood. It changes with sleep. It changes with stress, embarrassment, boredom, appetite, distraction, discouragement, and emotional weather. If your behavior depends on something that variable, then your standards will keep becoming negotiable. And once standards become negotiable, strength becomes inconsistent. You start living by preference rather than by principle. You do what matters when it feels manageable and quietly lower the demand when it does not. That is where self-respect begins to weaken. Because self-respect is not built only by what you admire in theory. It is built by what continues to hold when comfort would prefer retreat. It is built when you become someone who can say, "This is inconvenient, but inconvenience does not decide for me. This is irritating, but irritation does not choose my tone. This is difficult, but difficulty does not get to rewrite my commitment." That is what standards sound like. I begin when it is time to begin, not when I finally feel ready. I speak carefully when irritated, not casually from agitation. I continue through reluctance instead of treating reluctance as instruction. I return quickly after drift instead of turning one soft day into a softer identity. I do not let a bad mood become a bad policy. Notice what standards do. They reduce negotiation. Without standards, every hard moment reopens the debate. Comfort makes its case. Resistance makes its case. Irritation makes its case. Avoidance makes its case. And because no deeper law has already been established, the easiest voice often wins. But when standards are in place, some things are already decided. You do not have to reinvent your values each time discomfort appears. You remember them and obey them. This does not mean becoming rigid or punishing. A mature standard is not cruelty. It is protection. It protects your future from today's softness. It protects your discipline from momentary moods. It protects your character from being redesigned by whatever feels easiest under pressure. Most of all, it protects the mind from becoming a place where comfort receives more authority than principle. That is why standards must lead where comfort pulls back. Because comfort can tell you what would feel easier, but it cannot tell you what will make you stronger. Comfort can tell you what would reduce friction now, but it cannot tell you who you will become if you keep obeying that logic. Only standards can hold that longer view. Only standards can preserve continuity when preference keeps changing. And over time, that changes something profound. You stop asking, "What do I want to do right now?" You start asking, "What kind of person am I practicing being here?" That question is stronger because it reaches beneath mood. It puts character back in charge. It reminds you that self-control is not a performance of intensity. It is the repeated decision to let principle lead where comfort would rather retreat. That is how strength becomes behavioral. That is how self-respect becomes repeatable. That is how the mind stops being trained by ease and starts being shaped by something steadier than preference. Delay almost never introduces itself as danger. It introduces itself as a small adjustment. Not now. A little later. When I feel clearer. When I have more energy. When the mood is better. When the pressure feels lower. And because the delay sounds temporary, harmless, even reasonable, most people do not feel the real cost of it until much later. They think they are postponing a task. What they are often postponing, little by little, is the development of strength. That is what makes delay so deceptive. It rarely feels like weakness in the moment. It feels like timing. But if the mind keeps reaching for a better feeling before it is willing to move, delay stops being a scheduling habit and becomes a character habit. It becomes a way of relating to effort, a way of approaching friction, a way of teaching yourself that action depends on emotional readiness rather than principle. That lesson weakens a person. Because every time you delay something necessary for the sake of comfort, you are not just preserving ease. You are training reluctance. You are teaching the mind that resistance deserves negotiation. You are teaching discomfort that it only needs to appear in order to buy more time. And over time, that repeated postponement makes beginning feel heavier than it once did. The task has not necessarily become harder. You have simply become more practiced at waiting. This is why delay quietly erodes seriousness. A person still says they care, still says it matters, still intends to return. But intention without timely movement begins losing moral force inside the self. You start hearing your own promises differently, not as commands but as possibilities, not as standards but as hopes. The inner voice that once said, "I will do this," becomes softer, less credible, less anchored in evidence. That is when self-trust begins to weaken. Because self-trust is built partly through timely obedience to what you already know matters. Not eventually. Not when conditions become ideal. When it is time. And if later keeps becoming the answer, something in you begins to notice. You begin to sense that your standards are easier to postpone than they should be. You feel yourself becoming less decisive, less immediate, less serious in the face of necessary action. That quiet disappointment is not random. It is the mind recognizing that delay is no longer an exception. It is becoming a style of self-betrayal. Think of how often this happens in ordinary life. A conversation needs to happen, but you wait for a better emotional window. A task needs to begin, but you wait for more energy. A return is needed after drift, but you tell yourself tomorrow will be cleaner, stronger, more disciplined. And tomorrow repeats the same negotiation. That is the trap. Delay feels harmless because it protects you from immediate friction, but what it often costs is harder to see: urgency, confidence, decisiveness, momentum, and the self-respect that comes from moving when movement is due. A person who delays too often starts becoming someone who needs too much emotional cooperation in order to act. That is not just a habit problem. It is a strength problem. This is why self-control must be understood as timely movement. Not rushed movement, not impulsive movement, but timely movement. The ability to begin before the mood fully agrees. The ability to return before the feeling of delay becomes identity. The ability to stop treating emotional readiness as a requirement for obedience. Because if you wait long enough for a better feeling, the waiting itself becomes the habit that keeps you weak. And once that happens, delay is no longer about time. It is about who keeps getting to decide your life. Your standards, or your reluctance. Not all weakness arrives through obvious indulgence. Some of it arrives through softness that sounds compassionate. A person feels resistance, and instead of challenging it, they make room for it. They feel inconsistency, and instead of correcting it, they explain it gently enough that nothing changes. They feel discomfort, and instead of asking whether it should be endured, they assume it should be reduced. The language is tender, but over time the effect can be quietly destructive. Because compassion without standard becomes permission. This is one of the great confusions of modern inner life. Many people are trying so hard not to become harsh with themselves that they accidentally become too soft to train themselves. They confuse understanding with exemption. They confuse kindness with lowering the demand. They confuse emotional care with giving reluctance a protected place at the center of decision-making. That softness feels good in the moment. It soothes pressure. It lowers tension. It protects the self from effort, correction, or honest confrontation. But if it keeps replacing challenge, it begins weakening the very person it is trying to care for. That is the paradox. A person says, "I've had a hard day, so I won't ask much of myself." Then the next hard day says the same thing. Then the next. Eventually, difficulty becomes a standing reason to reduce the standard. Or someone says, "I need to be gentle with myself right now," when what they really mean is, "I do not want to face the friction this requires." The language sounds kind, but if gentleness always protects you from discomfort, it does not mature you. It leaves you dependent on ease. This is why mature self-compassion must be distinguished from permissiveness. Real compassion tells the truth. It sees fatigue honestly, pain honestly, fear honestly, limitation honestly. But it does not automatically turn every difficult state into a permission slip. It asks a wiser question: what kind of response would actually care for me in a way that makes me stronger, not softer? Sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is recovery. But sometimes the caring response is also the demanding one. Begin anyway. Return anyway. Hold the standard anyway. Do not let this feeling decide more than it deserves to decide. That is not cruelty. It is respect. Because endless softness can become a quiet form of abandonment. It spares you the discomfort of training, but it also withholds the structure through which strength is built. It keeps you emotionally comfortable while leaving you underdeveloped in the very places life will eventually test. You can see this in ordinary patterns. A person keeps excusing delay because they do not want to pressure themselves. They keep softening the routine because they want to be understanding. They keep lowering the standard after every lapse because they do not want to feel bad. But gradually, the self notices something. This version of kindness is not making me stronger. It is making me easier to overrule. That recognition matters. Because self-control does not require hardness, but it does require honesty strong enough to say, what I need is not always what feels soothing. Sometimes what protects your future is not another layer of emotional softness. It is a clearer boundary, a firmer standard, a refusal to turn every difficult feeling into a reason to retreat. It is between care that strengthens and softness that weakens. One helps you remain human while growing sturdier. The other keeps you comfortable while leaving your character untrained. And if you want a stronger mind, you must learn to recognize the difference, because the self is not best served by being endlessly soothed. It is best served by being cared for honestly enough that weakness is not allowed to disguise itself as kindness. The deepest danger of comfort is not that it makes life feel easier. It is that, if you let it lead for too long, it begins designing the kind of person you become. That is what many people fail to see. They think comfort only affects moments, whether they begin now or later, whether they push through or soften the demand, whether they return today or give themselves another excuse. But when those moments repeat often enough, they stop being moments. They become architecture. And slowly, almost invisibly, a whole life starts getting built around what feels easiest to endure. That is a comfort-built life. A life where mood decides when effort begins, where resistance decides how much gets done, where emotional inconvenience decides what gets delayed, where the need for ease quietly becomes more influential than principle, timing, responsibility, or long-term strength. And at first, this kind of life does not look disastrous. It may even look normal. You postpone a difficult task because you are not fully in the mood. You skip the harder standard because today feels unusually heavy. You wait to return because you want a cleaner emotional start. You keep choosing what lowers friction in the moment and tell yourself you are simply being realistic. But the cost of that realism accumulates. Because every time comfort decides when you begin, endure, return, or follow through, something deeper is being trained. You are teaching yourself that commitment depends on emotional cooperation, that consistency is negotiable, that your standards remain valid only when they are easy enough to keep. And once that training settles in, self-respect starts weakening from the inside. This is why comfort can quietly dismantle a person without ever creating obvious collapse. It does not need to ruin your life dramatically. It only needs to keep making you easier to negotiate with, easier to delay, easier to distract, easier to soften, easier to excuse. And when that happens for long enough, the damage is no longer only behavioral, it becomes existential. You start feeling less solid in your own hands, less serious, less trustworthy to yourself, not because you have no values, but because you keep watching comfort edit them in real time. That is a painful thing to live with. Because the self notices. It notices when you say something matters, but only pursue it when the day feels supportive enough. It notices when you speak about discipline, but repeatedly kneel to relief. It notices when you promise a return, but allow comfort to keep revising the date. And after enough of those observations, a quiet conclusion starts forming. I can admire strength, but I do not yet fully live by it. That is where self-respect begins to erode. Not through one big failure, through repeated small permissions that teach the mind an unbearable lesson. Ease has more authority here than principle. This is why self-control cannot remain an occasional act. If you treat it like something you use only in extreme moments, comfort will still shape the ordinary structure of your life. And the ordinary structure matters most because character is not built mainly in rare crises. It is built in routine choices, in whether you begin when it is time, in whether you stay when it gets dull, in whether you return when drift has made softness feel deserved, in whether you keep allowing comfort to be the architect, or finally choose to let something stronger design the life. That is the real distinction here. A comfort-built life is organized around reducing friction. A strength-built life is organized around honoring what matters even when friction is present. One feels easier now and costs more later. The other asks more now and gives back solidity, trust, seriousness, and inner freedom over time. So the real question is not whether comfort has a place. It does. The real question is whether comfort has become structural. Whether it is no longer just something you enjoy, but something that quietly decides the rhythm, standards, and moral shape of your days. Because once comfort becomes structural, self-respect starts becoming unstable. And once self-respect becomes unstable, life begins feeling softer in the wrong places. That is why self-control matters so deeply. Not because it makes you severe, but because it refuses to let ease become the architect of character. And in the end, that may be one of the most important adult decisions a person can make. Whether to build a life around what soothes them, or around what strengthens them. One of the quietest forms of damage comfort creates is not only inconsistency. It is distrust. Not distrust in life. Not distrust in other people. Distrust in yourself. Because every time you know what should be done and still let comfort overrule it, something inside you notices. Every time you promise yourself you will begin, return, endure, or hold the standard, and then surrender to the easier option instead, the self registers that gap. It registers the distance between intention and action. And after enough repetitions, that gap starts becoming a wound. That is why self-trust matters so much. And that is also why it cannot be built by intention alone. A person can want to be stronger. They can admire discipline. They can speak sincerely about the life they want to live. But self-trust is not built by wanting. It is built by evidence. Can I trust myself to do what matters when comfort offers me a softer version? Can I trust myself to begin when resistance is present? Can I trust myself to stay when effort becomes dull? Can I trust myself to return after drift, instead of using drift as permission for more of the same? Those questions are answered one way only, through proof. Every pause you keep becomes proof. Every hard thing you begin before you feel fully ready becomes proof. Every standard you honor under resistance becomes proof. Every return you make after softness, delay, or avoidance becomes proof. And proof changes a person. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. Because slowly, the self starts receiving a different message. It starts learning that comfort is no longer the final authority. That reluctance can speak without deciding. That discomfort can appear without causing collapse. That resistance can be present and still fail to govern the direction of the day. This is how self-trust returns. Not through grand declarations. Not through self-hype. Not through imagining a stronger identity and hoping it eventually feels true. It returns through repeated self-command under friction. That is why disciplined action has such emotional power. It does more than complete tasks. It restores credibility. It begins healing the internal fracture created by too many soft permissions. It proves that your deeper values are not helpless in the presence of discomfort. It proves that your commitments are not entirely negotiable. It proves that when life becomes effortful, there is still something in you willing to lead. That matters more than many people realize. Because once self-trust begins returning, life feels different from the inside. You stop feeling like someone who is always recovering from their own softness. You begin feeling more solid in your own hands, more believable to yourself, more able to rely on your word even when the mood is not particularly supportive. That is a profound form of dignity. Not perfection, not hardness, not flawless consistency. Just the quiet dignity of becoming someone who can be counted on from within. And that dignity does not come from intensity. It comes from repeated honesty in action, from refusing to let comfort keep speaking on your behalf, from proving, again and again, that the easier path no longer has automatic control over who you become. That is what self-control gives back to a person when it is practiced long enough. Not just output, not just discipline. Trust. The kind of trust that does not come from hope alone, but from lived evidence. The kind of trust that says, when resistance comes, I may feel it, but I no longer disappear inside it. The kind of trust that slowly turns strength from an aspiration into a relationship you can finally believe in. Many people look at someone who is steady under pressure and assume they were simply born that way. They imagine mental strength as temperament, a gift, a natural composition, something certain people possess and others do not. And because of that belief, they quietly excuse themselves. They think I am not built like that. I feel too much, tire too quickly, negotiate too easily, fall off too often. Strength belongs to other people. I just have to manage my weakness as well as I can. But mental strength is rarely possessed in the way people imagine. More often it is practiced. It is built through repeated acts that look almost ordinary from the outside, staying when comfort suggests retreat, starting before the mood improves, returning after drift without turning drift into identity, refusing to let resistance become the final voice in the room. None of these moments look dramatic, but together they form the architecture of a stronger mind. That is why strength becomes much more attainable the moment you stop treating it like a personality trait. Because if strength is only temperament, then the listener can admire it without building it. But if strength is trained character, then everything changes. Now every hard beginning matters. Every resisted excuse matters. Every honest return matters. Every refusal to soften the standard matters. You are no longer waiting to become stronger first. You are participating in the process by which strength is made. This is the real dignity of practice. Practice does not ask you to become extraordinary overnight. It asks for repetition, for continuity, for a willingness to keep meeting life in a more disciplined way, even when that way still feels unfamiliar. And over time, what is repeated begins to reshape what feels natural. What once felt difficult becomes more available. What once required unusual effort begins becoming part of your posture. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity can feel powerful, but it is unstable. A person can have a highly motivated day, a sharp emotional breakthrough, a strong burst of resolve, and still remain weak in the deeper structure of their life if those moments are not followed by repetition. Strength is not built by rare surges of seriousness. It is built by repeated obedience to what matters when the emotional atmosphere is ordinary, dull, resistant, or inconvenient. That is how steadiness forms. Not through one great act of control, but through many smaller acts of self-command. Through staying, starting, returning, refusing comfort-led surrender often enough that the mind stops assuming softness is the default rule. Through enough practice that self-control no longer feels like a performance you occasionally give, but a way of being you increasingly inhabit. This matters because it frees the listener from mythology. They do not need to wait for a stronger temperament. They do not need to become naturally hard. They do not need to feel unusually powerful before real change can begin. They need practice, honest practice, repeated practice, imperfect but serious practice. And that is hopeful because practice belongs to ordinary people. It belongs to tired people, rebuilding people, inconsistent people, people who have drifted, softened, delayed, and negotiated too much but are still willing to begin again. Mental strength is not reserved for a rare kind of person. It is built by the person who keeps returning to what strengthens them often enough that one day, almost quietly, self-command stops feeling borrowed. It starts feeling like their own mind. What changes when a person stops building life around ease is not that life becomes harsh. It becomes sturdier. There is an important difference. A mind shaped by comfort is always asking how to reduce friction, how to soften the demand, how to wait for a better feeling, how to make the day more emotionally manageable before fully stepping into it. But a mind shaped by self-control asks a different question. What choice strengthens me here, even if it asks more of me now? That question changes everything. Because adulthood is not simply the freedom to do what feels good. It is the maturity to choose what builds strength, clarity, and self-respect, even when something softer is available. It is the ability to stop confusing what soothes you with what serves you. It is the willingness to understand that some choices comfort the present self while quietly weakening the future one. And once that becomes clear, life begins feeling different from the inside. Not easier in every moment, but cleaner, more coherent, more trustworthy, less governed by softness, less dependent on mood, less vulnerable to every small argument comfort makes when effort, boredom, uncertainty, or resistance appear. That is the real gift of self-control. Not severity, not constant pressure, not joylessness. It gives you back a stronger relationship with yourself. You begin to notice that hard things stop feeling quite so threatening, not because they have become pleasant, but because you are no longer automatically interpreting difficulty as something to escape. You become more willing to begin, more willing to stay, more willing to return, more capable of enduring ordinary friction without turning it into a full emotional negotiation. That is strength in its mature form, not dramatic toughness, not an intense performance of discipline, just a quieter, deeper reliability. The reliability of someone who no longer needs every decision to feel emotionally ideal before making it. The reliability of someone who can face effort without immediately searching for relief. The reliability of someone who is no longer building identity around what is easiest to tolerate, but around what is worthy to live by. This does not remove pleasure from life. In fact, it often makes pleasure healthier. Because when comfort is no longer the ruler, it can finally return to its rightful place. A gift, not a governor. Rest becomes restorative rather than evasive. Ease becomes enjoyable rather than controlling. Relief becomes something you use wisely instead of something that quietly trains your whole character. That is the closing truth of this journey. If you keep choosing what merely soothes, the mind becomes easier to weaken. If you begin choosing the harder good, the mind becomes stronger. Not instantly, not perfectly, but reliably. Each harder good teaches something. Each harder good says, I can endure more than comfort taught me. I can move before I feel ready. I can hold a standard when softness would rather negotiate. I can refuse the smaller life ease keeps offering me. And over time, those decisions build a person. A steadier person. A clearer person. A less governable person. A person whose life is no longer designed around avoiding friction, but around becoming equal to it. That is what self-control ultimately is. Not the rejection of life's comforts, but the refusal to let them become your master. Not the worship of difficulty, but the understanding that some difficulties are the price of becoming stronger. Not a harder personality, but a stronger mind. So the final question is simple, but it is not small. Will you keep choosing what soothes you? Or will you begin choosing what strengthens you? Because that choice, repeated often enough, becomes character. And character, more than comfort, determines the kind of life a person is able to carry.